Hello and welcome to GZERO World. I'm Ian Bremmer, and today, a look at where things stand with the global economy as we all wake up from the darkest days of COVID lockdown. Was the cure worse than the disease, or did swift action help set the gears in motion for a quick recovery, at least for some of us? I speak to economic historian Adam Tooze. He's a professor at Columbia University, and his new book, Shut Down: How COVID Shook the World's Economy, tries to make a little sense of the last 18 months. Then, the average student loan borrower in America holds $39,000 in debt. Could the Biden administration cancel it? But first,
to all you kids down there, I was once a child with a dream, looking up to the stars. Now, I'm an adult in a spaceship.
I want to thank every Amazon employee and every Amazon customer, because you guys paid for all of this.
if these statements from Richard Branson and Jeff Bezos, two of the world's richest men, felt cringeworthy to you, you're clearly not alone. Look no further than the woman sitting next to the former Amazon CEO. As the pandemic increased inequality around the world, U.S. billionaire wealth skyrocketed by nearly 60%. This massive gain in wealth for the world's richest aligns nicely with the increased interest in billionaire space travel. But COVID-19 hasn't been as kind to people who aren't heading into space. The IMF says that the coronavirus has pushed at least 120 million people into extreme poverty, and the global economy could stand to lose $2.3 trillion by 2025 due to vaccine inequality, a burden that will be mostly shouldered by people in the developing world. Even in places with high vaccination rates like the United States, access to education, childcare, and healthcare are posing big problems for the country's poor. Despite these inequalities, America's economy has rebounded quite quickly. Both the International Monetary Fund and the Congressional Budget Office project that the U.S. economy is on track to grow by around 7% in 2021. Americans today have less consumer credit card debt than they did before the pandemic, and unemployment has dropped precipitously since the post-pandemic high. But we may not be fully back in the black quite yet. Economists disagree about how long increased inflation will last, global supply chain shortages persist, and we are a long way from vaccinating the world's poorest populations. Let's also not forget about the threats we still face from COVID-19 itself, including new variants and the possibility of reduced vaccine efficacy over time. If 2020 was a dry run for our next big economic disaster, how did we do? I spoke to economic historian Adam Tooze about what lessons we should learn from this dark time, as well as his new book, Shut Down: How COVID Shook the World's Economy. Adam Tooze, economic historian, so glad that you're joining me on GZERO World. Thanks.
Pleasure to be here.
So last time we spoke, if I remember correctly, you said that it wouldn't be implausible if by the end of 2021, U.S. unemployment could be close to 20%, certainly in the teens.
You know, to come down from the numbers that we're headed towards this summer, it wouldn't be implausible that you would be in the teens 18 months out from now. No, on the contrary, in fact, I mean, given how high we're likely to go, you know, a number around 20% is altogether possible at this point.
That is not where we are right now. Now, I am not orienting this interview to do gotcha politics with Adam Tooze, but I do want to ask why you think the recovery has been so much more robust than you might have expected.
No, I mean, it's a fair question. I mean, I think the last time we spoke, we were really in the middle of the economic meltdown, spring, early summer of last year. And I don't think any of us anticipated in our lifetime seeing the kind of headlines that we were seeing out of the American labor market at that time. I mean, those Thursday morning 8:30 a.m. releases of the numbers of Americans signing up for unemployment benefit were harrowing. They were extraordinarily stressful, even for somebody who has secure employment and is just worried about the state of the world. I think there was a state of panic at that moment, and I think it was well merited and well justified. And we know unemployment did indeed surge into the high teens and in many communities well above that. So there was good reason, I think, to be as concerned as we were. What I don't think we anticipated were basically two things. The first is the vaccine. I mean, that's the turnaround event, right? It's the fact that we were able basically to get a grip on this disease in some of the advanced economies through the vaccine. And we simply didn't have any reason to expect a vaccine to be as effective as it is and to come as quickly as it did. And the second thing, of course, is that we were still beginning to flex our muscles with regard to economic policy. And the scale of fiscal and monetary stimulus that we've seen is as unprecedented as the shock of the spring of last year. So we have seen a remarkable countervailing force put in play on a scale that I'm a historian of 2008. And nevertheless, it took me, as it did other people, by surprise how large the fiscal and monetary mass was that was mobilized across the world to prevent the worst.
Yes, across the world, indeed. And I mean, certainly not in any way coordinated, but nonetheless felt like everyone was reading from the same playbook, both from a fiscal and a monetary perspective. Do you think, were lessons learned from 2008 that carry over constructively for the ministers of finance, the Secretary of Treasury, the central bank heads today?
Absolutely there were. I think, when we learn from history, we should recognize the fact, it's the cliche is, of course, you can't, and it's always even dangerous to do so. But I think in this case, we can say that lessons were learned. It's in fact, some of the key staff at the central banks are veterans of 2008. So when the order comes to buy assets, to do QE, they really know how to do it. And they do it on a scale which is literally an order of magnitude, 10x larger than what we saw in 2008. There was coordination in the way it works in the global monetary system, which is it doesn't have to be a sit-down meeting of the G20 finance ministers. What you need is for the Fed to lead. And if the Fed leads, it signals to the markets and by way of the markets to even emerging market central banks that it's okay, despite the hemorrhage of foreign capital that was happening last year, to lower your interest rates. A combination we never thought we'd see, that Indonesia would be cutting its interest rate in the face of a loss of foreign capital. Indonesia being at the heart of the Asian financial crisis of the late 1990s, suffering a huge legitimacy hit, regime change, fully able to ride out this storm. And that is enabled by the Fed's actions. More locally in the United States, the learning on the part of the leadership of the Democratic Party is palpable, it's manifest. They are trying not to repeat some of the mistakes they, in retrospect, accused themselves of having made in 2009. They went too small, they didn't go big enough in that first, the only stimulus the Obama administration got to fire off.
From a political dysfunctionality perspective, the United States isn't offering many lessons these days. But economically, when you look at the latest numbers coming out from the World Bank, the U.S. 2020-21 looks a hell of a lot more robust and resilient than the EU or the UK or, of course, Japan or Canada. You're the economist here. Tell us, where you think the league tables look right now and why.
It's important not to confuse growth rates with levels here. So it is true that the US economy is bouncing back at a remarkable rate. What we're doing, though, is achieving the not slight achievement of returning to the trend we were on before, even going slightly above it. So the United States is now growing back towards the trend level that you would have expected before 2019. That is the achievement of economic policy in the US right now, not to have permanently slumped below that trend, which is what we saw after 2008-9. Compared to the Europeans, this is a remarkable achievement. Europe is not expected to attain its pre-2020 level of GDP, let alone the trend of, as it were, it hypothetically should have been, until the end of this year or beginning of next. It has not fundamentally changed the balance in the sense that China rebounded much more rapidly and using the familiar formula of heavy industrial investment is powering ahead. So the gap between China and the United States, despite America's impressive growth rates right now, will continue to widen because China is not just clawing its way back to where it should have been. It's actually powering ahead on that growth trend to levels we've not seen before. The worries about China's growth are, of course, real and will continue to be real. And they did go back to the old playbook of heavy investment. And we're seeing that in their demand for iron ore, in their demand for steel, for coal right now. But that is, I think, the fundamental continuity. Where the real hit is going to come, the world-changing hit, is in the situation of the emerging markets, and particularly Latin America. because the emerging markets came through 2008-9 relatively well. Latin America leading that charge because it was a commodity-driven boom with China sustaining their growth. Latin America right now, still in the midst of a terrible pandemic there, is looking at a lost decade.
It does feel, while the United States is now powering ahead, that the developing world is further and further behind, not the globalization story that we were hoping for.
I think that's right. And as far as the US is concerned, you would hope that all eyes really are on the rest of the Western Hemisphere. This has got to be a matter, I would say, of absolutely urgent concern in Washington. Mexico, our immediate neighbor, coming through the crisis, very hard hit. In fact, one of the big beneficiaries of America's stimulus is Mexico's export sector, but the Mexican economy per se has taken a huge hit. And the other, of course, giant piece of the Latin American puzzle is Brazil, where the crisis has been profound. And how in the hugely polarized politics of Brazil, Bolsonaro's future plays out against an increasingly worrying, I think one has to say, financial backdrop. Brazil, one of the players who in 2020 did a big fiscal action on the scale of an advanced economy, 10% of GDP roughly, also quite progressive as a result of pressure from Congress in Brazil, trickling down, spending down very substantial amounts of cash to the tens of millions of people who scrape by. How any of that can be continued into 21 and 22 should really, I think, be a fundamental concern of American policy. That's the crisis that's closest to home for the US.
So much discussion now about recent inflation numbers, particularly in the United States, higher than people expected. Larry Summers, of course, raised alarms on this early and was pushed back really hard by the Biden administration. Most economists, you're an economist, what do you think?
I think we shouldn't exaggerate our fears around this. The bounce back in prices is real. There are a variety of different effects, some of them statistical. If prices went down last year, they're bound to go up this year by larger percentage points. There are real shortages. If you've tried to build a house or do any repairs this year, you'll know that lumber was literally just short. You couldn't get it. But I think most people agree that these are transient effects. And when I say most people, I mean the best informed decision makers in central banks globally, on both sides of the Atlantic, and also the markets have stuck with the Fed in its assessment that this is transient. And we, again, should just have a sort of check on ourselves, like, why are we panicking? And what does that panic relate to? And to my mind, it still is a sort of undigested legacy of the trauma of the 1970s. That's the last time there was any inflation in Western Europe and in the United States. And, if we're still, as it were, working off the hangover from 50 years ago, I think we do need to update our priors. We need to update our economic vision. The problem, and it remains the problem, is in fact deflation, lowflation. The fact that we aren't able to push long-run inflation expectations well above 2%. And why that matters, we'll just look at our debt pile. If you've got the kind of debt pile that we have, historically speaking, the gentle way to deal with that is have inflation just a little bit higher than interest rates and bite away at it year by year. That's how Britain and America did it after World War II. That's the comfortable way to work your way out from underneath a debt mountain.
So as an economic historian and one of the world's preeminent in your field, having now gone through almost a couple of years of pandemic, what do you think is the biggest lesson, longer-term lesson that you've learned as we've experienced all of this?
That we need to take the Cassandra seriously, right? Looking back on this, the emerging infectious diseases paradigm, the emerging infectious diseases paradigm, so-called, appeared in the 1980s. It ran in parallel with the climate change diagnosis. Both of these were predicted to be the consequence of modernity, of globalization, and we did not take that risk seriously enough. And we are, in a sense, I think, still not taking it seriously enough in believing that we're done with this crisis or that it's over, and that therefore, the world doesn't fundamentally change and we grow back to where we were before. Surely what's happened is a window has opened for us on huge risks which are inherent to the system, from which we prosper, from which we benefit, to which we are committed to, irrevocably, I take it, that we will have to manage in future. And those risks are not slow-moving, not gradual, not measured in a percentage point of GDP here or there, or in 1,000 lives, 10,000 lives here or there. They're measured in millions of lives, and 20% of GDP loss occurring in a matter of weeks and months, right? That's the sort of scale. It's not trench warfare, it turns out, it's blitzkrieg. It's something that comes at you with lightning speed. And if you do not have the capacity to react quickly, you can be looking at the largest economic disaster in recorded history. That's, I think, for me, the lesson of 2020. I mean, it's sort of appalling to digest it, but we at least do have a clear indication of one of the minimal things that we need to provide ourselves with insurance, which is a huge science apparatus. I mean, we're obviously terrible at the socio-political economic digesting of this. We've got some welfare state apparatuses that work not so badly, and the central banks do their job. But to address this problem, we're really, hopelessly under-equipped. But we do have a magic wand. We do have a silver bullet. And we should be doubling down on that. I mean, technology, if it is, it's perhaps not, as it were, the most holistic answer. But if it's an answer, and it's our strong card, we really should be doubling down on it. I think that's the same basic approach also to climate change. Given the likelihood that we are not going to be able to address it in a holistic fashion, you would think that we would be making enormously larger investments in technologies in that area.
Adam Tooze, economic historian and Columbia University professor. Great to be with you, sir.
Pleasure to be here.
It's not news that millions of people have struggled to pay their bills during this pandemic. Stimulus checks from Uncle Sam, of course, helped keep many people afloat, but were unlikely to cover the full cost of housing, food, and other expenses. Initiatives like the eviction moratorium and the federal student loan forbearance program were aimed at giving people an extra lifeline over the past 18 months. And while the moratorium has officially expired, the Biden administration just extended relief for student borrowers until January 31st, 2022. That's going to help the 43 million people holding student loans in the United States rest easier. But America's student debt crisis did not start with the pandemic. At $1.57 trillion, student loans have eclipsed consumer credit card debt and car financing as the country's top debt category. Since taking office, President Joe Biden has canceled more student loan debt than any other president. These cancellations, though, have only benefited 1% of federal loan borrowers, going primarily to people with disabilities, soldiers who fought in war zones, and those who have experienced fraud at for-profit institutions. Progressive Democrats like Ayanna Pressley, Chuck Schumer, Elizabeth Warren all say more needs to be done.
President Biden could cancel $50,000 worth of student loan debt basically with the stroke of a pen.
Canceling more debt, Democrats say, would help narrow the wealth gap between black and white borrowers, would provide extra relief from the pandemic, and help stimulate the economy. Republicans see things differently. They think this move would be unfair to current and future borrowers. It would present an unfair burden on taxpayers and unnecessarily subsidize high-earning professionals in jobs that require advanced education. And even some high earners are struggling. In one study, 60% of millennials earning over $100,000 a year say they are living paycheck to paycheck, in part because of student loan debt. Feeling broke and actually being broke can be two different things, though. Another study found that 20 years after starting college, on average, white borrowers paid all but 6% of their original balance, whereas black borrowers still owed 95% of their bill. Which begs the question, if the financial fallout from the pandemic plays out for years to come, what will happen to America's student borrowers after January 31st? That's our show this week. Come back next week. And if you like what you see, like what you hear, like the fact that we can just engage in all this great stuff about the economy and the pandemic and anything else that you're scared to talk about with people that are closer to you than I am, why don't you take a minute to sign up for GZERO's most excellent morning newsletter? It's called Signal.